Hey, Composing Gloves here, and today we're going to be talking about how I got into producing. This is just sort of my story. I'm going to skip over parts. If you're interested about more, I could tell you. I thought about making this like a really crazy edited video, but instead I'm just going to sort of tell you my story as I remember it. Parts are foggy, some parts have a lot more details. But I think I have a pretty unique story because I get asked a lot, how did you wind up where you are now, doing the things you can do now? And the answer is really, really smoothly. The everything's really connected. Actually, I remember very specific events very clearly. They left big impacts on me, and it's just interesting because I've seen where I've gotten pushed into directions that most people, like quite a few people, don't. But if you're watching my channel, chances are you're probably on a similar path. I've learned the one that I'm on now is actually one that quite a few others have traversed before. I think that's usually the case. But anyways, let's start off. So I didn't really have any music education growing up. I remember in third grade, we had like a guy come in with flutophones, and I thought that was really cool, but he only came in for like a week. And at the end, you could pay $3 for a flutophone, which to a third grader is like $1 million. So I couldn't buy a flutophone. And so fast forward to sixth grade, I joined the band. I could have joined in fifth grade, but I didn't. I don't know if it was for fun reasons or I just didn't go to the right meeting or whatever, but I really wanted to join the band and I really wanted to play flute. The second I was handed, we went and rented a flute, right? Because we're not sure if this is something I really want to do, but I was pretty sure this is something I really wanted to do, and it had to be the flute. I don't know why I was so into the flute, but it had to be flute. I think it was because no guys really played the flute. And I was like, I'm gonna play the flute. And I'm gonna be freaking amazing at it. So they hand me this, and I remember being so excited to try and play it, and I could not get a noise out of this thing. And the first day of band, they had an older flute player come and try to help you get noises out of your flute because it's so dang hard to get them out. Now it's like it's so easy once you know how, but that first time, especially when you're so young, because I had to wait weeks, right, for band to start, and then I just the flute, man, that was just such a struggle. Eventually, I did figure out how to make a noise out of it, but I didn't understand how sheet music worked. Like they would say, this is a quarter note and this is a half note. And I would have no freaking idea what the difference between a quarter note and a half note was. I didn't know that because it was hollow, that made it different. I had no abstract understanding of anything music. All I understood was I liked the way I felt when I made noise. And so I wanted to do that more. That was the only thing pushing me. And so I faked my way through it. There was a group of us who just didn't understand anything really. And so I would just sort of move my fingers along when people were playing or they asked us to play. And it was not good faking. They totally knew I was not playing, but we didn't have, my parents didn't play instruments. Well, my mom sort of plays piano, but it's like very, very beginner level piano. Because I guess my grandma, she died before I ever met her, or I think I was a baby when she died. But she apparently was amazing at piano. So I actually had a piano in my house for a while, but then we got rid of it because it was a really, really out of tune, old missing keys piano. So anyways, this was sort of my education. And so I'd go through this. Eventually I did figure out how to play the flute because I practiced my butt off. I remember I got like a weird spot on my thumb from holding it for so long, and my pinky would really hurt because I was doing all these things with my pinky. Probably not the best technique, but I learned my scales, and I would basically just listen to someone else play it, and then I'd practice until I could sound like that. And that was how I practiced. My brother hated me. There were all sorts of fights over me practicing too much. And that was flute. And so fast forward through junior high. At this point, I'm one of the better flute players in the band for a junior high school level. So I'm playing, and I progressed through there. I don't really learn how to read music still. I sort of live off the same thing. I just practice my butt off and have a bad understanding. I couldn't sight read at all. Like if you put a piece of music in front of me. So I was trying out for honor bands, but I just never got in because I couldn't sight read music. I didn't understand how music was read. Like at this point, the music could remind me on how it went, like the notes. I could read notes. I could point it and say this is an E or this is that. But I didn't have a sense of meter or tempo. I finally understood the difference between the different length of notes, but I had no understanding of meter or rhythm. So I was still missing some pretty fundamental things. Going into high school, this is where things started really turning interesting for me. So my freshman year of high school, so I joined the marching band. I was part of the Upland Highlanders. They have a really good marching band. It was like some of the parts of it are kind of like pretty dang intense. Like you stand in a block with, and you have to try out to get in. And the thing is, there's the marching band show, and I recently actually threw them away. I had a whole bunch of they give you these dot sheets, and these sheets are made by a drill maker who tells you how many steps you need to take in what amount of time to what position on a field. And everyone gets these sheets and it forms your positions, and then it's sort of like keyframes in animation. You practice marching between keyframes as an entire band until you can do it. And you practice your horn movements, then you add the music eventually, and away you're going. But in order to get into the show, because not everyone got in, I'm not sure if this is true for all marching bands, but you had to pass sort of this intro camp. In my freshman year, I struggled immensely with getting my left foot on the right beat. So right, you left, right, and your left had to be at the right beat. Otherwise, you were off. You're doing the other foot when everyone else is doing the other one. And there was a group of us, and since the flute players had so many players, some of these players were good. Like it was like astronomical level jumps because they had a winds ensemble that was really good. So at this point, I don't know about hip hop. I don't know about EDM. I don't know about rap. I don't really know about rock. I know literally nothing except the classical music that's been handed to me. And I really loved that. That was literally like my whole world. And I remember I like hated marching band so much because it's like you're there from 9 a.m. till, or even I think some 7 a.m. until like 5, which for a kid is like insane. And you're just marching around in the California heat. So it's like 90 degrees to 100 degrees, and you bring these massive water bottles and sunscreen and just all kinds of things. I remember directors, some drill instructors would get angry and he'd throw his phone on the ground and pick it up and be like, still works when you didn't do it right. But I was actually what was called a shadow. So I didn't actually get a part my first year. It's kind of complicated. I was sort of an anomaly. So I played flute. There were way too many flutes, and I wasn't a good enough marcher. So they had this parade that they decided whether or not you got in or if you were a shadow in the parade. And a shadow meant I didn't get my own part. I had to follow someone else around and learn their part. And I remember the girl was really cool. Her name was Brittany. She's super legit. And she eventually switched to playing tuba from flute. She was much bigger than me, like as taller wise. She could totally have beaten me up, like no problem. But she was really nice. And I remember just feeling super dejected, like because there were like 200 of us in this band. And out of all of that, I was like one of like 4 people who was apparently so not good at marching and music that they had to set me aside as someone to learn someone else's part in case they couldn't do it. And during shows, I could go on the shows because we'd travel over and do these shows, but I had to stand on the sideline and just play the music, which I was not a very good flute player with respect to some of the others that were there. At this point in junior high, I was riding all right, but here it was like a whole new ball game. So I was being really, really crushed. Like during rehearsals, I hated a lot of what I was doing. Like I was not into it. But I still worked pretty hard. And then halfway through it, there was a clarinet player who was told that they cannot be in the marching band because they didn't sign up for the concert band for the school year. And apparently that's a rule, I guess, you have to follow. So he got kicked out. So now they had an empty spot, and they offered me a spot. By the way, I love all my directors and drill instructors, but I just had some hard times because of all these things. Like I think it can really mess with when you're that young. It's kind of I don't know how I feel about it as a decision because it really left a mark on me. Like I still have problems every now and then thinking back on like the fact that that you could be dejected like that in a group of so many, like the odds of you being the one, it just makes you lose confidence in yourself to a degree. So I got offered the part though halfway through the season, which means I sort of had some faith restored because now I had to learn the entire show for a completely different part in half the time. It was just crazy. So I do that, and I end up learning it. It took a while, and I was given the part I was given. It was a key spot on the field, so I was in one of the more important spots. So I had a lot of the older band members, sort of, because you have your section leaders, and I had all sorts of section leaders telling me like what to do and to change, and because I was in spots where I was in the front, I had no point of reference. I had to just know exactly where I was on the field and how big to take the steps. And I couldn't play clarinet at all, keep in mind. So first I had to go get clarinet. Lo and behold, my mom friggin' played clarinet as a kid. And so we pulled out her really old clarinet and it still worked. We got it rekeyed, or not rekeyed, repadded. And so now I'm learning clarinet, barely. I still, in my mind, I was a flute player. I was just marching the clarinet. But the director immediately, we had way less clarinets for some reason than flutes. Like we had 30 flutes. and only like 10 clarinets. And so some bands have way more, some have way less. I was in a bigger band, so that was considered, a stark difference. So I learned this whole show, and it was just crazy. There were shows where I only knew the latter half of the show, and so I'd run in from the sideline during this part where we'd all scatter and then come back in. What was the name of that show? I think it was Reflections. You can find it on YouTube. It even have the one. It was a dome. I remember we were in Flagstaff on that one, and I got yelled at because one of the drill instructors told me in secret. He came up to me. He was like, "Hey, when this part happens, you run in there during the middle of the show." And this is a competition level show. But I mean, all sorts of things can happen because bands could do these weird shows because we're doing marching band, right? So it's like you just run in there like you're supposed to be there. So I ran in there and did the show, and I came in on the wrong foot, of course. But I mean, at this point, I was living. So that was really, really cool. I did concert band, and I stayed on clarinet. He wanted me to stay on clarinet, and so I wound up becoming good at clarinet. And so that was my freshman year, and that was a really, really important year for me because of how intense that was. My sophomore and junior year, I learned the clarinet, and the concert band, there's like a higher band called Winds Ensemble where you're playing some pretty intense music. So I really wanted to get in that band. I maintained my flute, and then I just sort of eventually focused on clarinet. And so I learned my scales, and I began to learn how to read rhythms and things of that nature. And I remember the director every now and then. I just have this like aha moment and in it because when I played clarinet or flute or whatever I was playing, I'd move a lot. Like I can't sit still when I'm playing clarinet or like when I'm really genuinely playing music. I just move. It just happens. So it was kind of interesting. When you get to higher levels, you see some players who sit very still, and usually those people have rigorous training. Like they're trained a bit more because they're taught that to express yourself through music rather than moving, because it can be considered a distraction during performances. Whereas myself and others who sort of are struggling on our own, we tend to move more. And it's true. If you look at hip hop producers and things, when they're hitting those pads with like one finger, like probably the worst possible technique that is out there, but yet there's so much musicality in it. So I think it's kind of interesting. You look at the amazing performers, there's something to each person's style. So I felt like I was discovering my own style. So there's still no production in this point. I still have no clue what a DAW is. I don't know what recording is. I have no idea what a microphone is. But I begin to learn. My sight reading improves a little bit. I still have no clue what freaking meter is, like at all. So sight reading's still out the door. And I begin, and there's this competition that goes on. I remember I was in Spanish class, and they had a competition come up called Reflections. And it was for composers, and you could win an iPod. And I was like, dude, I want an iPod really bad. Like, because my brother had an iPod, and they were so cool because you could touch them, and that was a big deal at the time, right? Because these were the first touch devices. So I was like, my senior year, fourth year, I was like, I gotta get this iPod. I really want it, and I love music. And at this time, I was walking around school, and I would like narrate thoughts to myself as if it were like a book. And I would also notice that I could like generate music in my head. Like I would think up entire symphonies in my head. And at the time, I thought this was like, oh man, this is really cool that I can like do this sort of a thing. And I'd try and make them as clear as possible in my head. There were never any EDM or drums or anything. It was always like classical music because that's where I lived. So these things sort of convinced me that I might stand a shot at composing. So I went in after my Spanish class, went straight to my director, and I said, sir, how do I don't know if I should say names or not, so I'm just going to call him sir. But I said, sir, what kind of program do I need to compose? There was no way I was going to write the music because I could barely understand meter. Like I had no idea. So he said, oh, well, you can get, and he listed a few. And the one I wound up going to grab was Finale. And at the time, so there's Finale and Sibelius. Finale had a free notepad version, but for whatever reason, it cost money at the time, which my family was going through a horrible financial crisis. Like we were going to lose our house and a bunch of other things. So that was completely out of the question. Like I could not spend money in any way, shape, or form. And I didn't have that much experience with money. So that was just off limits. So I went and I found a cracked version of Finale, which, I'm sorry, Finale people. I've actually bought the software proper now. But I didn't know anything about what I was doing. So I got this thing, and you could say what instruments you wanted, and I played clarinet. So I picked clarinet, and the theme for this competition was called Together You Can. So I was like, oh, okay. So I'll put two clarinets and write a clarinet duet. And I spent like 2 weeks putting in notes one by one, and I would just guess. I had no idea, and this really began to give me a sense of what meter meant and what rhythm meant. And also, I had no clue what harmony was. Like, how do people pick the notes they put? So what I would do is I would just sit there and think of a melody, try and put it in. But because my understanding of rhythm was so poor, I never got anywhere near the melody I was thinking in my head. So I would put it in and then move it up or down a little bit. And eventually I'd wind up with something after enough pushing play, I'd wind up with something that I liked. And that was how I worked. And it drove me insane because it took me so long to do anything. Like if I put two notes down and they sounded bad, I'd just move one note and hit play. No, move another note and hit play. And I began to learn things like I began to sort of figure out a little bits of music theory on my own. Like every other note sounded good. I didn't know it at the time, but this was because thirds sound nice together, especially when they're going together. And sixth, I found that if there were certain distances, they sounded good and other distances didn't sound so good. I relied heavily on octaves and things. But I came up with this little duet. You can actually, I'm not sure if it's online. I don't know. But it was called Together We Can. And I actually ended up getting it recorded. So I had to go and get it recorded. I had no idea how to do this. So I went to someone from my church and he gave me like this mic thing. And he said, you push this button and you play and you push it when you're done and it will record it. And then you can hear it back. So I got this, another clarinet player. His name was Brandon Torres. I believe it was Brandon. I can't remember. Anyways, I said I was going to do names. He was really, really cool. So we went and we played this thing. Or was it another? I can't remember who I grabbed. But anyways, we recorded it, submitted it, and I ended up winning all the way up to like state or whatever the highest level this thing went to. And so I was really excited. I've actually got a blue ribbon in the back of my room. It's still pinned up there where with it because that was such a huge that I was a composer now. Like I'd been hooked on a kind of drug. Like you could not stop me. I was already thinking like, what if I did it for like, because mine was largely guesswork, but I spent so long refining it. I'm like, what if I now choose 3 saxophones? And that one I believe was my first YouTube video. I actually had a channel before this one. It's still on YouTube called Mr. the Penguin for Forever because I was really into penguins. So I was now a composer, and in my mind, composer was like a very high thing. I was like, I had to do this. So I remember, once you start composing, what you were doing when you were composing certain things and dealing with certain problems, sticks to you. Sort of like a memory when you're going through a trial. You remember a lot of circumstances. Like I remember scenes from my childhood super clearly because I was composing. So I had actually wound up with a laptop at this moment in my life. And so I was using Finale, and what I would do is I didn't crack Finale at first. Eventually, I did crack Finale, but what I did initially was I downloaded the trial of a really old version of Finale, and then when that trial ran out, I would get the next edition, and I would do that until I got all the way up to the present, which was like 2011 or 2012 or something like that. And that was what my game plan was. And then once I was there, I was like, crap, what do I do? And so then I would just that's when I learned that you could crack them. Because I had like the internet was not a thing really in my household. And we didn't have like gaming consoles until I was much older. So this whole thing was like a big process. But along the way, there was a book so I was going through and learning how to compose, and I had composed a second piece now that was called Xenix, which you can find on Mr. the Penguin Forever. And it involved 3 saxophones. And again, I was spinning forever, changing notes, and there was a lot of loops and things. And so this sort of went on, and I went to 4 instruments, and I started composing every single day because I read this quote that said, like, you have to because I was like, how do people get good? And then it said that you just had to pump out pieces every day until you got good. So I was like, okay, because every time, I even made it my computer background, this quote, because it said that every time you do that, you're going to pick up a little trick. And eventually you'll get so many little tricks that you'll just know what to do. And so that was my plan. And I composed like 3 pieces every day for like a year. I have an absurd amount of Finale files where I remember I went through every single instrument that was tonal and made a song with it. But during this time, I was like, I got to get better. This is all still my senior year. Like I am like on fire now. I am cooking like with gas. And I remember I gave my mom my second piece and she was like, wow, we need to find a way to copyright this. And that was all I needed to hear before I was like, I have a gift. I need to keep going. It was very encouraging to me at the time. And so I was doing this, and so now I wanted to know everything about music. I was no longer satisfied with just playing music. I wanted to know the whole everything. Because I remember at one point, I even asked one of my instructors, he was explaining that he learned music history. And in my experience, history was a boring subject that I fell asleep in. So I was like, why would you want to know anything about music history? That sounds so boring. And then it was then that I realized like how wrong I was. Like, so there are these people in the past who figured this stuff out and how to like do this. So I went and I was going through my school library. They had a music section, and there was a book that completely like altered like the course of my life pretty much. So like the first one was this, hearing that announcement on the competition was like one, and the second one was there was this book. And so I just recently bought them. So I went back to my junior high and they still had it, but they wouldn't sell it to me. So I got the name, and the reason I got this book, it was called An Anthology of Music. And the reason I wanted it was because at the time it had a really cool cover. Someone made a really, really cool cover. I had no idea what anthology meant, but it had the word music in it. And when I opened it up, it had some stuff about composers' lives. So I was like, this seems like something interesting to read. And at the time, I was taking this history class where the instructor would sometimes fall asleep while lecturing. Like she was really, it was, I probably shouldn't say anything. It was bad though. Like, anyways, I'm going to avoid saying anything, but I don't want to cross any areas. So, but it was not good. Okay. So I wanted a book. And during this time, I was reading and I got these two books. And I actually, let's open them real quick. So I've been super excited for these. I didn't know that there were two volumes. I think the one that I was reading was just two volumes combined into one book. I could not find a PDF or ebook of this anywhere. And this book changed how I just view. It convinced me to do so many things. Where's the knife? So what the book had in it was there were these. It's basically just stories of composers in their lives. And there was this. It started off with Felix Mendelssohn. Oops, that kind of hurt. Yeah, it started off with Mendelssohn, and I was like, Mendelssohn, but I couldn't say his name because I had no idea how to say any of these guys' names because they were all freaking crazy French and whatnot. So what I would do is I would ask my friend. There was this flute player that was really gifted, but I think I annoyed her more than anything. And I would say I didn't understand how to say this guy's name because I don't know if you've ever seen it spelled, but it's like Mahesendolon or something like that. So I could never say it right. Even after someone told me how to say it, I would always forget. But now I remember because he's kind of a big deal. And yeah, Felix Mendelssohn. And I read about his sister and the relationship he had. And it was when he died. I was sitting in history class and something like hit me. And I was like, I have to learn piano. It wasn't like I want to learn piano or I had a desire to learn piano before. I don't even think I had a desire before. I didn't, but I read about him and how he grew up in his piano life. This is the first one. Oh my gosh. This is going to be so great. Does it say discard on the side? Shame on whoever put this here. Oh my gosh. Anyways, yeah, I don't know what it was, but I read about him and the way he died in his life. And then I read the next one and the next one. And I was like, I have to learn piano. Like, I have to. It was like destiny was calling out to me and said, you must learn piano. And so I said, if I'm going to learn piano, I got to learn it proper. So I wanted a real piano. So at the time we had a keyboard and I began to practice like mad at this keyboard. I began to look out piano instructors. I basically had to teach myself because I just could not afford lessons at the time. So I was teaching myself, and I also went and I found a theory book in the public library, which was like the worst theory book on the planet. And so what I began to ask my instructor questions. He didn't really know music theory, so he kept sending me to the jazz instructor. And I very quickly started asking questions that he didn't know the answer to because I began to learn that there was like a system. There was like a code to this stuff. And it was like linked to the piano. And the other note thing was like a thing. And so I had all my intervals down. I was going through chord progressions and asking him questions about like extended harmonies and all these things because all of a sudden I could put notes down, and just by looking at the notes, I knew what it could do, and that there were certain sounds you could hear, and you could tell just by hearing it what notes were going and what they were doing. I didn't know what counterpoint was yet, but what I ended up doing was I went to my to a local community college and I just bought their textbook. and I just read that. Like I wasn't even going to college. I just went, I bought that book. I saved up enough money for it because it was $100 for a book. I couldn't believe it. And yeah, I just read that book and like I just was like absorbing information like inside and out. So the way I got my piano, because I did get one eventually, um, is I just offered to help people move and then if they had a piano, I'd ask them if they were taking it. And eventually, someone said they were not taking their piano. And that's how I wound up with my first piano, which was the source of a lot of fighting and arguing because I would practice this thing for hours. And I didn't, I would look out for, I would try to find people who could teach me, but I was pretty much self taught. And the way it worked was I would find a piece that I really liked. And this is what I discovered musical basics around this time and was super inspired by musical basics. There was actually like a whole experience that led up to me sort of finding his YouTube channel. I was going through something called the Creche Festival. It was like a bunch of creches of the birth of Christ. It was like a bunch of little scenes of it. And I was walking by one room where a guy was in there playing piano. And I'd never really heard, because I grew up in the church and I like heard piano being played, but I never like heard real piano playing. You know what I'm saying? So I was walking by, and that's like the first time I really remember hearing a piano be played, like really played. So I went in there and I basically, I didn't actually I didn't. I was too nervous to go in. So I just sort of sat outside and listened. And then he went up and he ended up performing at the Creche Festival. And I also went to a early morning seminary class. It was like for church, and because I live in California, so we had like a separate class, and then we'd go to school after. It was an early morning class, and one of the days he was one of the proctors in the hallways, and I asked him to teach me piano, and he's like, I don't know piano. He's really really humble, and so he agreed to eventually, and so I would drive up to his house. My parents would drop me off, and I would just learn piano from him. And he showed me musical basics, and I became obsessed with those songs. And those were some of the first songs I really tried to learn. So I immediately went to like relatively difficult piano music for someone that was a beginner. But I would just practice for hours. I remember thinking, how can anyone hit four notes with one hand? That's impossible. And I just practice and practice and practice. And then so I was reading these books, practicing, reading theory books. I was, my clarinet playing was going through the roof, and I was learning like three other instruments along the way. I learned bassoon to a degree, clarinet. I got my flute playing back up, and I had made it into the top band, winds ensemble, and I was the first chair for the third clarinets, which if you're a first chair, he didn't want to move me into the fourth, or I'm not sure exactly how this all worked, but you could challenge people to go up. But I liked being the first chair for the third because you got the solo parts for the third clarinet. And I thought that was pretty cool. And I would also be given permission to go into practice rooms during a regular concert band to go practice by myself because sometimes it was really focused. And a lot of the sessions, you kind of get chewed out in a lot of music classes. But anyways, that was like my whole like, there's still no producing. But at this point, I'm well into composing. I'm fascinated with all these things. I graduate, and then now I'm going to college. I went to Mount Sac first, but I didn't understand registration. I didn't understand a lot, man. I was really off. And I should also mention that I was a B/C student. Like I failed geometry 3 times. So I was done with geometry. I hated the subject. I hated math in general. I was not fan. I was actually ahead in junior high, but then I was just lazy, so I just didn't do too well. I wound up getting mostly B's. But yeah, I did not do well in geometry at all. I had several really bad teachers for geometry also, so that didn't help. Like one teacher talked more about Dancing with the Stars than they actually did about geometry. It was very frustrating. I had no idea how people were remembering things. And so this is actually relevant because if you look at where I am now, my view is totally different. But so I eventually graduate, and now I'm composing. I've been to school, and I've been reading all these things. So I go to Mount Sac. I only take music courses. I have zero interest in doing literally anything else. So I go there. I go to the orientation, and I'm just like, ignore the whole thing and just sign me up for music classes. And I remember I didn't understand paying, so I just didn't pay. But because the director wants you in the band, he just let me stay in the band. And I was taking this directing class too. So I actually I took some formal classes on proper directing. And I was like I remember I was the only student to use a baton. I went out and bought a baton, and I was like, Haydn, no, 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 no. And I was given a Haydn piece. It was one of the more difficult ones because I had experience with small conducting from church. So, and I was learning piano on my own. And I mean, I was vigorously practicing like 4 to 5 hours a day plus composing. And it got to the point where if I didn't make something that day, I felt like I had like wasted my day. Like I felt almost bad. So I just had this insane drive to do things every single day. And so that's what I did. And I was working through all those MIDI sounds in Finale. And I was like, man, I want like cooler sounds in this because I couldn't understand how some people. First of all, my music wasn't making great progress because I was like, how do people make these cool sounds? And I began to play more interesting things in college, but I came across. I didn't sign up for any music theory courses. They were all performance courses because I read the music theory book and I was like, do I really need this? And so, but I really didn't have a good grip on music theory. I had a very rash understanding. I barely still understood how to sight read. Like it was pretty bad. And I was still picking up piano, and basically my work ethic is what was carrying me. But there was this professor named Dr. Robert Bowen who would allow me to come in during his office hours. I went and sought out a music theory professor, and I could show him things I had written in Finale. And I never realized how cool this guy was until after I was gone. And I would play it for him, and then he would tell me things. Like it wasn't like regular theory. We spoke as he spoke to me as like a composer would, and gave me insights and ideas and notions. Theory was almost never brought up. Like he never mentioned intervals or thirds. He'd talk about ideas that I was pushing. There was never any talk about technical details. It was about what were you trying to communicate? What was the purpose of this? The piece, what was it there for? And so it was very, very enlightening. I never realized how cool he was until it was like I could probably still go find him. He was really, really, really cool. He made a big impact on me. And I had also a legendary director. His name's Dustin Barr, and he now is the director of bands at Fullerton, which is ironically where I go now. So that's just like extra ironic. And he also is great because at this point, I should mention this. My senior year, before I didn't understand any theory or anything really, right? But I went to my director and I said, "Hey, if I write a piece for the entire band, will you play it?" And he kind of laughed and was like, "You're not going to do that." I'm like, "Yeah, yeah, yeah, yeah. But if I do," so I did, and it's called The King's Court. And I think I put a MIDI up on Mr. the Penguin Forever. We did play it. And I remember being so impressed with how real instruments sound over the MIDI. It was like someone had just sent me to heaven. It was so cool. Even though it was a terribly out of tune band, it was still eons better than the MIDI files. So parts of it were really reasonable, but I had a lot of impossible parts for like tuba. Like I didn't understand tubas couldn't go as high as I wanted them to, and a bunch of other things. But anyways, that was another massive achievement. I also learned printing things like that is insane, and you have to be really patient. I didn't understand how to print parts because I was always just preparing full scores. And at this point, I'm writing quartets. I'm doing things for the clarinet choir. I mean, I'm just doing all kinds of things. So at Mount Sac, I came in contact with Margaret Worsley, and she was the clarinet private teacher. So I auditioned to get into the bands, and I got into all the bands that I wanted to get into at Mount Sac for my clarinet playing. My sight reading wasn't the best, but I mean, I did all right. So she's like this fantastic clarinet player, and she was the private instructor. And I got in on a scholarship, but apparently I used the scholarship, but I still didn't pay for my classes. I don't understand. I don't have any records of my time at Mount Sac. But they she so I learned clarinet from her, and it was like my musicianship was brought to a new level because we talked about the impact of playing a single note, things like expression, and I began to realize I had an intuitive understanding of being expressive, and that not everyone had this. Which it's still a little hard sometimes because when you meet musicians and you play, most people just understand what to do. It's usually what frustrates us so much is you know what you want to do, but you can't do it because there's technical things in your way, and it's frustrating. And usually people who have this can't get very technical, or they don't get very technical because they'd rather be expressive. It gets in your way, but it's also like the reason you want to do it, and it's what makes it fun. So it's very, very confusing. And because of the way I was learning piano, tied up with just practicing really hard, I began to integrate techniques into my fingers. So I began to get ways to improvise. So the piano became an instrument for me to talk through instead of something where I just read. It wasn't like a book I would read, like you give me music and I read it. It was like I expressed myself through this thing. And all the instructions that I was getting from my clarinet instruction and piano instruction brought me to understand certain aspects of this. Well, granted, still a lot of things, like I'm still foggy on certain things in music. Everyone is, I think, to a degree. But I began to really understand things. Like there were lessons with the clarinet where I would play. I was lucky to get to play a couple notes, right? Like we'd play, but we'd spend a really, really long time on long tones and just, which is like you literally are playing tones long. They're exactly what they sound like. And they're about as much fun as what they sound like. But you focus entirely on things like tone, timbre, mouth shape. And I mean, I was doing these things like I'd bring my clarinet with me to the hotel when I traveled because my dad would do these meetings and I would do these in the hotel. And I was always afraid someone was going to come in and tell me to be quiet because long tones took like a half hour to do. So, and I mean, I got a million times better, so much better. And, um, and I began to realize like I I never practiced as hard as I really should have because I was so interested in composition. I began having all these ideas. I was writing papers on ideas of like if you like I was interested in what music would be like to experience if you found a way to make yourself deaf for such a period of time and then was found a way to make yourself not deaf anymore. What kind of music would you write? I had questions like this, a lot of them. Where did the emotion in music come from? With Dr. Bowen, we got in this big thing about what makes music scary versus sacred, and it got really, really, really interesting. And I brought it up in several other classes. Apparently, he brought it up in classes because some students came to me. So there's all these ideas, and Maggie introduced me to the notion of John Cage, and I learned about minimalism and Philip Glass. John Cage is into silence, and there's all these things started pouring in, and it was around this time that I finally heard dubstep. I had always relegated all other music to being lower in my arrogance because I'd read about all the composers and the intensity of their lives. And I learned about such integrity when you're playing an instrument. And I was just like, no other music could have this kind of quality to it. When you listen to the progressions of rock and all these things, like I was horribly ignorant of literally everything, every other kind of music. So that was completely on me. My pride was stopping me. But at some point, I heard dubstep, and for whatever reason, that got through to me. I think it was a Seamless R song, and I was like, "How do they make that sound? What is that sound? Is that even a note?" Because now I was into noisescaping, right? I was studying these composers who were questioning what harmony even was, and so I began to ask everyone I knew, literally anyone, which I knew no one on the electronic scene, how to make dubstep. What do I need to do with this? And so my first attempts, I had such a hard time. I think you can find them on my old channel. They are really, really bad. I had no concept of what dubstep was or how to make it. I didn't understand at all. Like it was conceptually hard for me to understand because I was so ingrained. Like I didn't know drums. I didn't know what drums did or were. I was like, drums are just the percussion in the back of an orchestral track. So I'm doing this and I finally get a hold of FL Studio. I even remember where I was. I was at my dad's shop the first time. I didn't understand the looping concept because in Finale, you just add measures and keep writing. But in this, you had to draw on a grid, a piano grid, and you had to do these. Like the whole thing was confusing to me. I hated it. I hated everything about it. I didn't know what a mixer was. I didn't know what plugins were. I didn't know what a browser was. I mean, I knew like nothing about this. And around this time, my computer had a meltdown, like it literally melted. My motherboard like overheated, and I took it because I didn't know any better. I took it to Staples, and I lost like all my files because they're idiots. And so I actually called this after crash every file after this. So I lost everything. I still have some things due to the way I backed some of the things up, but I lost a huge portion of my work. But in a way, for me, it was kind of like cool because I could start over in a way. And so I hated FL and I dropped it. And then several months later, I tried it again because I found Seamless R and I saw what Seamless R projects look like. My projects didn't look anything like that because in my mind, when you're writing notes, you put your notes down and then once your notes are there, you add expression markings and then you're done. That's like what you do. Then the rest is up to the performer. There wasn't any sound libraries or mixing or a sound design or synthesizers or automation. None of these things existed. So to me, I was done. So when I started in FL, I would write notes and I would dig through presets and I would come across like Citrus had so many knobs. I was like, I don't know how anyone knows how to use this synthesizer. It's impossible to know how. Or keep in mind, I was not into math. Like these sorts of things were way too technical for me. They were no way, no way. I felt completely overwhelmed. No way. And at this time, I'm like probably like 14 or 15 or something. So I needed so I went on a mission for my church, and Maggie was actually she was kind of bummed because I had this understanding of emotion that's I've now taught music, and it's so hard to teach it to someone who doesn't. So what I usually do is I tell them to just play certain notes softer and then louder, and then to try and feel it. But I've learned that like some people just like they think different. They just think different. That's all it is. It's not bad, and I think that you can develop the skill, but there's definitely people who have it more intuitive than others, and there's gradings of it. So I'm not the most capable of it, but I'm definitely more capable than others are. So, um, anyways, so she was a bit bummed out about that. I went on my mission, and that's where I got into like metaphysics concepts. So usually I began to really question what I actually believe, and I had this whole thing. I'm gonna sort of gloss over the mission, um, but at this time I came back and I was like, I must learn FL Studio like my life depends on it. And I'm like 19 at this point. So, and I was determined. I was just gonna on my mission. I learned what it means to study and think abstractly. So I wanted to learn everything. My entire viewpoint of school. I had so many life changing experiences on my mission. It's difficult to like tell you how important that was for me. So when I came back, I had a way, way better view of sort of what I was going to do. So I was going to study 5 hours a day and do this. My parents were not chill with this idea though. So I went and I got a sales job. It was the worst job I ever got. I could tell you about that some other time. There was just, well, there were many, many good things about the job, but it was so stressful. And so I ended up the deal was I could get a job or I could go to school and I would be sustained while I go to school. So I decided to go to school and I quit my job. It was one of the best days of my entire life. And now I have all this sort of deep philosophy, and I'm still very interested. I'm super interested in metaphysics and philosophy. I'm reading a book right now on what it means for a number line, the topology of the real line. It's math and philosophy to me are kind of the same thing at this point, but that's another story. So, anyways, I'm at school and I want to begin. I want to make projects like Seamless. I think a lot of us have been there where we find someone that we really like and want to make stuff like them. For me, it was originally the Great Composers. And then I want to learn this new tool because it was capable of so many unusual sounds. And this is something that sort of sticks with me. Every time this tool comes up that's really different, I get really into it. So I'm reading the manual for FL. Like I'm memorizing hotkeys. Like I'm going to learn this thing. And at the time, my beats sort of went like put in notes, automate them, or not even automate. I didn't know what automation was. Put in notes, and then the only place I knew to change the volume was the little ostrich heads at the bottom, the velocity markers. So I'd move those, and then I would render. That was it. And there was clipping on everything, always clipping, because I didn't know what volume knobs really were. So a lot of those early beats you can actually find, and I remember you could sort of see where I began to sort of understand where drums come from and like not where drums come from, but how drums are supposed to be used in beats. Because I wasn't listening to beats. The only thing I really listened to at this point were like EDM sort of dubsteppy kind of things, but I didn't even know about the greats. I didn't know who Skrillex was. I didn't know who Deadmau5 was. I didn't know what Monster Cat was. I was introduced to Monster Cat from Seamless R's video. He mentions it in one of his videos. So this whole thing just starts cascading and cascading. But at this point, I'm working in FL Studio every day, producing a loop, getting like workflow things under my belt. And eventually I learn what a mixer is, but I don't really understand plugins because there's all these different kinds of plugins too. Like now I feel like it's so easy. Like you could ask me about any of this stuff and I could just tell you way more than you'd ever want to know on the topic. But what I did was when I went to school, this time I'm not going to Mount Sac. I have a dead set view on learning every subject 100% of the way. Like I wanted to be master of everything. Like to me, learning was just exciting. And so the first class I took was a Math 30 class because I had to take this class. I went in to take this test and I scorched the English test because I've been reading the Bible and all these crazy books and having these deep conversations for 2 years. So when I come, like that was an easy piece of cake thing. Like give me an essay, I'll scorch it. But I had to take some of the maths, and I did get up to statistics in high school. I eventually made it out of geometry, and I had an easier time with algebra. But so I had to take Math 30. And during Math 30, because I was so interested philosophically in what was happening and my interest in sound was going, I was reading the manual for FM8 at the same time I was taking this. And at this point, I had started composing gloves and I had made my first video series. It was for Massive. And I had read the entire manual for Massive and was just making sounds. And I figured the best way to learn was to teach. So I would just make videos. I would read the manual, make several sounds, try to understand what was happening. And there was so much math that kept coming up. And I also desperately wanted better sounds than those dang MIDI files. I wanted to know how to make a synth do something that sounded cool instead of relying on presets. And so that was my main motivation. So while I was taking this math class, I remember it was with Professor Aldrich. It's my first math class. I was also taking history of rock and roll because it was a summer semester. So I was taking two classes and I was murdering both of them, like into the dirt. I just like math. I was so invested in wanting to know how it worked. I questioned everything. I got told to stop asking questions about numbers because you start off by talking about integers, irrational numbers, and then I don't think were defined that great. And then but it was a math. It was like algebra. Like there were students in there who were not interested at the same level I was. And he mentioned briefly imaginary numbers, and I remember thinking, what are you even talking about? What is this mysterious thing you're talking about? And he told me to just let it go. And if I get to the higher levels of math, and it was at that moment I like told him I will get to whatever the highest level of math is offered here, and I'm going to go all the way. And like it's Math 30. That class is like 3 years away. Like I'd have to that's taking math every single year. So at this point though, I'm just digesting manuals. So I'm digesting manuals, working in FL Studio, all these things. I'm beginning to get a grip on what plugins are, and because I'm reading all these manuals, and I had started my YouTube channel, I was getting way good at like just knowing what things did, like automatically. And actually, I've read so many manuals at this point that I like when plugins don't do something that I've read that like 8 other plugins do. It's like I don't know. It's just interesting seeing all the cross relations because the philosophy started coming in. The math started coming in. And when that started happening, I was also taking all these music courses at the same time. And I wanted to get into the audio program at Citrus. That's why I picked Citrus. They had a audio program. And I went in, you had to take these 3 prereqs, which were sort of like gate classes. They were super easy. And once you got in, you had to take an interview then. And so my interview was like easy as pie, like easiest interview because I didn't know it at the time, but I was a way more solid student than other students. Like I was straight A's across the board at this point because I basically started over and I was just interested in everything. Like if you told me like, oh, we're going to be studying like Shakespeare, I'd go out, I'd get a book at the library on Shakespeare and I'd read that whole book over the weekend. Or not the weekend, maybe like 2 weeks. I would read the whole flipping thing and then go on to the next one. Like I voraciously ate books. And so the amount I retained, I decided to slow down and study deeper instead of so much quantity. But it gave me a huge edge for a lot of things. And when I wrote a paper, I'd get so into it. So composing, going through this, I'm learning this. We get to there, and this is where my experience with hardware really started to go up. And I was way more advanced in sound design at this point. And so by the time I'm taking Citrus, I had grown because this was over the course. By the time I got into the audio program, I was kind of like at a point where Seamless R wasn't giving me the depth, ironically, because he knows so much, right? But there was none of the math. There was none of the details. Like I was interested in like advanced harmony at this point. And so I began to rely more on books and advanced blogists and things like that. I would just dig around until I found things. And so I went through that. And when I was going through the program, my sound design skills were very, very high at this point. So I was just killing it as far as like synthesis goes, I was owning it. But the program was almost all about recording. So this was great because what it ended up doing was I had a huge edge in understanding processing and signal flow. I knew how compressors worked. I knew how gates worked. And there was all these other students. A lot of them had no idea how these things worked. And so at times I was able to explain things and it helped me, it helped them. And we became like a team and we were given certain things and we had to make a studio work and I experienced patch bays and consoles and all these things. And so over those 2 years, I made a lot of really good connections and I read a lot of books. I read a whole book on digital audio, like real digital audio. Like my professor even took one of the books I was reading and gave me another book that was more recent and said, read this one instead. And it was on the design of audio interfaces in digital audio. And I was just reading these things. There was so much math I didn't know, but I would take what I could understand. And I was in trig at the time. And eventually I got up to, so at this point, I finished all the way past differential equations. And I could keep taking classes, but now I sort of read special books like on the side. And I'm loosely studying partial differential equations. And I could take my ordinary differential equations much further because that's the math you need to know DSP. But at this point, I know like a whole lot, and I've used FL a ton. I mean, I really get it. My projects looked way more sophisticated, and somewhere along this line, I was offered a gig through a really sketchy connection to compose. And so I was like, oh, okay, I'll take this gig. But he needed a piano, and I had been saving up money, and I finally had enough to invest in I wanted to get Omnisphere for a lot of reasons that were probably similar to yours. But the main one was I didn't understand MIDI. Like this is way back before I understood FL. I wanted to be able to just play things on the piano and have them be recorded. And so Omnisphere seemed like something that would do that for me. So I wanted that. It was like a preset machine, right? But I began to look around because it was like had like $1,000-ish, and I ended up getting Complete 10 instead because it looked like you got more for your money. And I didn't know it at the time, but this purchase was one of the most important purchases because of the directions it took me, because of the tools I had, because I now had Contact and I now had Reactor, and I learned KSP scripting. It was the first thing I really learned to program, and I made several small instruments, and that got me into C++, which enabled me to understand a lot of the algorithms in some of the books I was reading because they often talk directly in programming. In Reactor is just a crazy thing you can make filters in. I was making small filters and all these things and learning Reactor Core. So anyways, at this point, I know I'm getting through the calculus series and there were so many experiences in every single class that I felt like I was the only one that was excited about certain topics because I was seeing how they related to music. And I was like, this is how you do that? Like automation curves, for example, are piecewise functions. And when I learned that in pre-calc, and I was the only one, when the teacher said, this is what we define as a piecewise function, I was ready to throw the table over. I was like, that's the automation clips in FL Studio. I was so excited. So there's just tons and tons and tons of these things just started building up. And it's like almost overwhelming now. The ideas philosophically, my understanding of abstract concepts. Right now I'm reading about just things I never would have dreamed I'm reading about. And I've even like gotten several degrees in music at this point, or music and some in math, which you could not have convinced me to do more math when I was in high school. Well, I guess you could have, because I ended up taking it all the way up to my senior year, but that was mostly just because that was what the counselor said to do. So just this whole cascading thing, but it was really organic, like from step to step. And there were lots of things that happened that were really important. Like I played Ultimate Frisbee, and you'd be thinking, what does Ultimate Frisbee have to do with learning to produce? Well, I play Ultimate Frisbee vigorously. If you follow my Instagram at all, I'm always posting videos with Frisbee and disc golf. That was I just picked up all these passions, and I picked up playing with the Red Hill group, and I was one of the younger members, but one of the members that came regularly taught music theory at Azusa Pacific. His name is James Gutierrez. And so at this point, I knew some about the piano. My chord building wasn't the greatest, but I understood chord building. So he invited me to go and meet at the church hall because it's like a religious school. It's a Christian school. And so I went there and he gave me like a private lesson. I showed him what I could do on piano and I showed him a composition. And I was sort of doing what I did with Dr. Bowen, but now I understood a lot more because this is now after my mission. And I had a much different view. And so he looks at it, he gives me some advice, and we go down and we play the piano, and he showed me the circle of fifths, like in a way that made me understand it. And I remember being like, my eyes were opened. I was so insanely impressed with it. And so, actually, this was just before I left on my mission. I think because the day before I left on my mission, I had this lesson with him. I remember this is how I chose to spend my last day before I left for 2 years. And so that's how important this was to me. So he showed me this, and it was like a bolt from heaven had hit me. And I was like, the circle of fifths is life. Like, I went home and I wrote this piece and I sent it to him, and I was like, I remember driving home in the car just elated with the new understanding that I now had, because I had all these other pieces, and the circle of fifth just like connected like 8 of them at the same time. So yeah, so that's how I got into producing. It's kind of, there's more. I mean, I had so many experiences. If you're interested in knowing more, if you made it this far, thanks. It's pretty crazy. If you're wondering where I am now, I have a couple jobs. I do the YouTube channel also, or a lot of videos for the YouTube channel for music marketing TV. I read a lot of DSP books and a lot of philosophy books that go over things like formal systems. I work as a freelance teacher and sound designer, and also I do a lot of producing, as well as a lot more of like official like sound work. But I've dabbled in so many fields to extents that most people haven't, because I've got the technical abilities. So it's been kind of weird fighting my expressive side and my technical side and trying to get them to work together, because I go through bouts where I want to just write music and be expressive, and then I go through bouts where I just want to read and think critically. I've actually written an entire book on philosophy that I just never published, because I'm not sure I'll ever publish it, because I became fascinated with humility as an attribute of a person. Because to me, it's the most important thing you can have is be humble. It's like the key to learning everything. If you're prideful, you'll get stopped. And I wrote this entire book laying out my thoughts, but a lot of it's mingled with some of my religious views, so I'm hesitant to publish it. But it was just, I began to learn that if you just sit down and start writing, like, thoughts will come to you on that subject, and you can make so much progress just by writing. So I began to use this, and then piano playing became a thing. I could just sit down and play piano, and you read the histories of these guys, and it's pretty fascinating stuff. So yeah, that's what I do now. I have a Patreon. If you made it this far, you want to go to my Patreon and help me out. I'm trying to go through school on the day. So I finished up at Citrus and I graduated with my degrees, but they're all associates. So I wanted to go get a degree in electrical engineering, because I want to build synthesizers and really understand the programming and the building, and have a complete like, my goal is to basically understand everything there is to know about sound. That's like what I want to do, and I'd love to be like a college professor. I think it'd be so much fun to teach math or music or something, like anything. So a philosophy, it would be so great. So so I was doing so I graduated, and then I applied to Fullerton, and I have like 170 credits or something ridiculous from Citrus, because I maxed out my credits every single semester, just as far as they would go, because I had financial aid and I wanted to make use of it. It made me so frustrated when I saw people with financial aid just drop out on their classes, but everyone's in their own situations in their own time, so I can't be their judge. But man, I definitely had some like, man, how can you just give up like that? But then there's like things that they might have something going on in their life I just don't know about. So graduated, and I wanted to change as a music major. And at this point, I had done things like, I was on the Rocket Alice team. I was taking physics classes. I was like, what am I even doing? I want to be a music major. What is this? So I get the degree, and I'm going, and I decide at some point, there was a lot of like cool piano instructors that I had too that were really influential. I, s- I decided I wanted to go to Fullerton because of their music program. And Dustin Barr was the director of bands there now. I was like, that's so cool. But you have to audition to get in. And my piano skills, why they had gotten a bazillion times better. Like, I could like comfortably do sight reading if I just practiced enough. So, and I understood meter and all these other things. I had so much deeper, because I was interested in genuinely knowing the information. I was not satisfied with some of the things these textbooks try and sell you as, oh, I've taught you statistics. You do these steps. No, no, no. Why are those steps there? What are they? I'll do all this extra research and make my own notebook on how to properly learn statistics. But I did that with music. And so, but my piano skills just weren't all the way up there, because I was so invested in all these other areas of STEM. And it was honestly kind of like a hard thing for me, because I was like, I wasn't interested in performing like I once was. I was interested in being a designer and a philosopher and pushing forward ideas and teaching and all these other things. While performing would be really cool, I just didn't have the kind of time I needed to. So on the day, so I send in my thing for Fullerton, and I get like the extra super early acceptance letter, like before they even send out the early ones, because my GPA was like a 3.99 or 3.98 or something ridiculous. I know some people, you have like these crazy number of units and you have a 4.0. So good for you. I had a really high GPA and I had just ridiculous number of units as well. So I got into Fullerton. It wasn't, and it was the only school I applied to. I didn't understand. I mean, I know there's the idea is you apply to many schools, but they could charge you money to apply. So I was like, I'm taking, you get a couple of free ones. So I want to go there. It's where I want to go. Now I kind of wish I had applied to Cal Poly because on the day I went there, I hadn't done the audition, and so they wouldn't let me formally register for the music classes. So I showed up for the music registration day, and while I was there, in order to register, I just said, "Let me change my major." And I looked at all the things that they had, and I wanted the career because I figured at that point I could learn all the music theory and all that stuff because I already have the motivation to read and understand and push those things. And music professors are so cool. You could just go in and bother them and they'll like tell you stuff. Whereas I thought my education would be a little more well spent learning electrical engineering because it covered all the DSP courses. I was really close to, I'm like, I might double major in math. I don't know. Because I've been reading all these books on math. I can't stop. But they had all the music and sound courses, like the math side that I would need, like all the DSP, filter design, designing amplifiers. And so I wound up changing it and they let me change it, which I guess they're not really supposed to let you do. But I changed my major and I had so many weird looks like, you're gonna go from music to this. And I'm like, yeah, don't worry. I've already got differential equations under my belt. Like I can do this. And I learned that a lot of other people do this. And I learned also that I had a huge advantage because I understood synthesis and I had already made like small filters and things. And I had read about Fourier transforms. So I'm taking like beginner circuit classes and I'm just trying to come to grips with the physics of the dang circuits. Um, but just the way that things meshed, so interesting. So currently I go to Fullerton. They charge a million times more than Citrus does. I laugh at their thing. Oh, we will not charge you more than we have to. And they're bringing the parking up to like $270 or something ridiculous because they're going to build a new structure. And they like, I could go on about the cost. I made this whole post on Facebook at one point because I was so frustrated. But anyways, there's a little bit about me. If you have any questions, fire away. I'll answer them. If you've listened to this whole thing, you are like super cool. Don't really know what to say. I always kind of wished that some of the guys I really liked would make something like this. Like I know Seamless has a couple where he talks some, and I'd pick up pieces. But he was a big influencer for me. Musical Basics was another YouTuber, and then there were so many piano players. Even now, when I listen to them, like Valestina Listina, or UG Wang, or like Lang Lang, or there's a whole slew of them that just like you know, they're inspiring when you listen to the people who are doing what the level that you want to do. It's so cool. And then the professor started adding up. I'm never gonna stop talking, man. Okay, so this is it. This is the end. If you want to know more about the college experience or about any piece of this, I can always do more videos later if there's enough interest. Subscribe and have a blessed day.